episode 6 of the Zesty Dietitian podcast. I'm your host, Mackenzie Caldwell, registered dietitian, and this episode is going to be an interview with my lovely colleague and friend, Laura Dragon. She's amazing. I love her so much. She's a good friend here in Charlotte and is also a registered dietitian. And I'm going to be interviewing her all about Hashimoto's. And I'm so excited about this. Laura is definitely an expert when it comes to nutrition for Hashimoto's. And I'm just so excited. So a little bit more about Laura. She is a functional medicine and women's health dietitian. She uses evidence-based nutrition coupled with holistic and herbal modalities to help women heal their hormonal and digestive symptoms. Her approach emphasizes abundance over restriction, which we love, putting food first before adding in supplements, and testing, not guessing, about her clients' symptoms. So let's dive into it. Here is my interview with Laura. Thank you, Laura, so much for coming onto the podcast. It's so fun to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's just so fun having both a friend and a colleague on the show. And I wish I had access to a podcast recording studio, because then you could have just like driven over and then we could have gotten coffee or something.
Gosh, I know, yeah, just a couple of friends chit-chatting.
I know, yeah. I'll have to look into that for the future.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. So I'm so excited to jump into all things Hashimoto's today. But one thing that I like to ask all of my guests is something that I ask my clients, and that is, what are some of your favorite foods?
Oh my gosh, I love this question, but it's also so hard though to just name a few.
Yeah.
So I would say, like, in terms of meals, like if I could have like any meal like all the time, most of the time it would be tacos or some Greek food. Like I love like a Greek salad, some like good feta, Kalamata olives. Those are definitely like the meals, like cuisines that I like a lot. But then if we're talking like sweets or desserts, like my favorite dessert is tiramisu, actually. So I love a little coffee chocolate moment. So
Oh my gosh, yum. I love all of those. I'm also into tacos and chocolate coffee combos. In undergrad, my like graduation cap design was my plate, but then I did, instead of like the fruits, veggies, and all that, it was coffee, tacos, wine, and chocolate.
wait, I love that so much.
It went viral on Pinterest, which is fun. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Anyways, that's awesome. I love that. And what are some of your favorite ways to move your body?
Yeah, so right now I am loving tennis. I'm actually
So,
on a tennis league right now, and it's just so fun because I have like a super competitive side to me, so it just
uh-huh.
kind of scratches that itch just in terms of like, playing some fun matches, but also moving my body. But it's also like a very social sport and stuff, so it's just kind of checks a lot of boxes all at once. So that's definitely my favorite way to move my body right now.
I love that. I love that you have fun doing that, and it just like gets you out, and it's like
Exactly.
both social and like physically active too. So that's super fun.
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I have you on the podcast today to talk a lot about Hashimoto's, and this is something that I do not feel like an expert in. And a lot of what I've learned about Hashimoto's has actually been from you and our like coffee dates and me picking your brain and things like that. So I would love for you to tell us all about Hashimoto's. Like,
hmm
what is it, first
Yeah.
of all? Like, just let's start there. What is Hashimoto's thyroiditis?
Yeah. So I think before I get into what Hashimoto's is, I think I'll just start with like what the thyroid is.
Yeah.
So the thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland in your neck. And it produces thyroid hormones that are used in literally every cell in your body. And what Hashimoto's is it's an autoimmune condition where the immune system, for some reason, gets really, annoyed about something and aggravated, and then it decides to attack the thyroid. So that attacking of the thyroid is what Hashimoto's is. But Hashimoto's is the leading cause of hypothyroidism in the US. And hypothyroidism is when the thyroid slows down, so much so that it stops producing or not producing enough of the thyroid hormone. And then because of that, it causes like a cascade of, a number of different symptoms because your cells aren't getting the thyroid hormone that it needs.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. And very quickly, I think somebody who has never encountered having their thyroid checked, they'll see a high TSH and not really fully understand what that means and why
Mhm.
that is a sign of hypothyroidism. So can you walk us through like very briefly
Yeah.
why you would get a high TSH when you have hypothyroidism?
Totally. Yeah. So, and TSH, that is usually the main like marker that is run at your doctor's office to test for hypothyroidism. And TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. So it's actually coming from your pituitary gland and it's telling your thyroid, hey, we need to produce more thyroid hormone. And that's when it goes up because it gets higher and higher and higher if there isn't enough thyroid hormone to go around. So your pituitary gland's like, hey, wake up, come on, we got to produce more, we got to produce more. And that's when we see the first sign of, oh, potentially the thyroid has slowed down. So now we need to look further into why that could be.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's definitely really confusing. And
Mhm.
hormones are, I like to say, there's all these checks and balances in place.
Mhm.
So the body has multiple points where it's going to have like feedback loops, and that helps things stay as in check as possible.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's always super confusing for people when they see that on their labs. Um, so specifically, who does Hashimoto's affect?
Yeah. So it does affect women or people who are assigned female at birth about 10 times more compared to men, although it does still affect some men. And there's also a genetic component to it. So you're way more likely to have it if a family member also has it.
Mhm.
Um, and then there tends to be a genetic component, but then there's usually some type of environmental trigger that kind of, flips the switch. And then that's when people tend to experience symptoms. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
we see that with a lot of genetic conditions that
Yeah.
like you could have a
Mhm.
parent that has something, and if there's something in your life that happens, like a trauma or an illness or something, then it's almost like the gun is loaded with the genes, but the environment or the life circumstance or whatever is what pulls the trigger and actually causes the disease to happen.
Yep, absolutely. That's definitely the case with Hashimoto's.
Yeah. And what are some of the symptoms of Hashimoto's?
Yeah, so with Hashimoto's, there's like some controversy around if Hashimoto's itself causes symptoms or if it's asymptomatic until the thyroid stops functioning.
Mm,
However, when I talk about my experience, I definitely argue that it can cause symptoms in and of itself before the thyroid, stops functioning. But
mhm.
in general, like it would be fatigue, feeling cold all the time, hair loss, weight gain, dry skin, a lower heart rate, joint pain, depression, brain fog, infertility,
Mhm.
constipation, basically anything that you can imagine like slowing down in function, like
Mhm.
lower metabolism, like just lower body temperature, like just drier skin, everything, slower digestion, more constipated, everything slowing down when we have hypothyroidism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's really interesting. And what does the diagnosis process look like with Hashi's?
Yeah, so that's like the important and slash tricky part though is sometimes getting a diagnosis for Hashimoto's to begin with because like I mentioned before, TSH tends to be the main lab that doctors will run when they're suspecting a thyroid issue. However, if there is an autoimmune condition going on like Hashimoto's, you will likely have thyroid antibodies, which are TPO antibodies or TG or thyroglobulin antibodies that those are going to be what's elevated in the presence of Hashimoto's. So you can technically have a high TSH, but not have elevated
Mm-hmm.
antibodies. That's when it's just hypothyroidism, but not caused by Hashimoto's.
Mm-hmm.
You can also have high TPO or high TG antibodies, but not have an elevated TSH.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more so just about, can we get those antibodies tested? Can we see if they're elevated? And if that's the case, then getting that Hashimoto's diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like sometimes the body's in a place where the immune system is starting to act up, but it just
Mhm.
hasn't quite gotten to the place where it's started to cause a lot of damage yet.
Totally. Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
So tell us a little bit more about your experience. What were
Yep.
your symptoms? How did you get diagnosed? Just give us the whole
Yeah.
story.
Okay. So it's hard to say like what symptoms were directly Hashimoto's and because there's a lot of overlapping symptoms with a lot
Mm-hmm.
of other things, but I would say my first main symptom was extremely, extremely heavy periods.
Mm.
And that also, we don't know if that caused anemia or if there was anemia involved beforehand, but very, very low iron, extreme fatigue. I remember like literally just like fainting, like coming out of the shower when I was younger, just super, super exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it wasn't until college when I got diagnosed. I remember like my hair thinning a lot, feeling cold all the time, brain fog.
Mm-hmm.
And like when you're in college or when you're like busy and like you're, just changing, your lifestyle and like going from like living at
Yeah.
home to living, away, then there's a lot of things that you kind of are just like, I mean, this is probably just like the part for the course. Like
Yeah.
it's probably just normal or it's probably how everyone is feeling. And I think that's just what I assumed for a really long time
Yeah.
until I went to my doctor who thankfully was also my parents' primary care doctor
Mm.
also because she knew that my dad actually had Hashimoto's. So
Oh.
when I told her about these symptoms, she immediately, even though we had tested my thyroid before, my TSH
Mm-hmm.
before, and it was totally normal, she knew, okay, let's test for the antibodies to see if you have Hashimoto's.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, those came back super elevated, like in the thousands.
Oh, wow.
So I was very much affected, though, by, you know, this autoimmune condition that hadn't totally or hadn't really at all like affected the actual thyroid hormone production, but it was definitely causing me symptoms, though. So,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And what kind of treatment did your doctor recommend at that point?
Nothing.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's what's tough though, is like you can get a diagnosis from the doctor of Hashimoto's,
Mm-hmm.
but it's important to understand that from a medical doctor perspective, they will treat hypothyroidism. They'll treat
Yeah.
hypothyroidism when the thyroid is no longer functioning.
Mm-hmm.
So because my thyroid was still functioning, like she couldn't prescribe what they usually would, which is levothyroxine, which is thyroid hormone replacement. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, sh- so we didn't do that. We did try um, we tested me for other autoimmune conditions, which I think is really important to for anyone getting this done, because anyone who has like one autoimmune condition, you're automatically more likely to have another one. So she
Mm-hmm.
did immediately test me for celiac disease.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, like in retrospect, definitely important. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have celiac disease, but I do see a lot of clients who do have it,
Mm-hmm.
weren't tested when they initially were diagnosed.
Yeah,
Yeah. So do you see
absolutely.
that too?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one thing I remember learning is that autoimmune conditions like to come in sets of three, which is a little terrifying to think
I know.
about.
I know.
So yeah, it's always something that I like to remind my clients of too, to get tested, and I do see that for sure.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, wow. So if you are seeing somebody come to you and
Mhm.
they have Hashimoto's,
Yeah.
what are some of the most common myths that you hear or that you've been seeing floating around social media?
So definitely the main one is that you just have to go gluten-free,
Okay.
or that you have to do what's called an AIP diet or an autoimmune protocol diet, like for
Hmm.
life. I would say that is definitely not AIP. I mean, if you're familiar with AIP, it's very restrictive
Yeah.
and yeah, very stressful, honestly,
Hmm.
to keep up with. Gluten-free, I would say, is like it depends on the
Yeah.
person. It is definitely not something that everyone needs to do. It is very person specific.
Hmm.
And it's way, way more about, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but more about like lowering your overall like stress burden and
Yeah.
like just overall inflammation rather than just pointing to a certain food and saying this is the thing that's causing my Hashimoto's. That's not the case. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anybody's curious about inflammation, that was my very first episode of this podcast, was all about that. And there's so many more basic things that we can do, like
Mhm.
sleeping and eating
No, exactly.
vegetables,
Yeah. Yeah.
going to therapy, and just like having a safe home environment. There's so much more that we can do
Mhm.
that absolutely can just help everything calm down. And sometimes when people are to be able to do those more basic things, they don't need to do anything in addition. So how would you help a client decide to
Mhm.
trial gluten free if they didn't have celiac disease and so that had already been ruled out? Then
Mhm.
what would you
Yeah,
look for?
so typically I first like to see what else is going on in their
Hmm.
life first and what's like more of like the low-hanging fruit. Like what's something that we can focus on first that maybe doesn't feel like overwhelming to take on right away that will lower your overall stress burden like right from the get-go. So typically I number one that I'll do is just see if anyone has like nutrient deficiencies because that is
Hmm.
something that's pretty common with Hashimoto's too. Is just like some absorption issues. And so like in my case like iron was extremely low, so even just correcting something like that automatically takes some of the stress burden off of your body because
Yeah.
it doesn't have to like be searching for that and figuring out like how it's going to survive with like such low iron.
Yeah.
Like that, but as well as like other nutrients as well. So I see a lot of like low B12 and vitamin D
Hmm.
and even iodine. So just like different things like that. Just like seeing if there's anything that we need to either emphasize more in the diet, supplement if possible, or if necessary. So starting there, making sure they're eating enough food too. So, just making sure that we're not like under eating either consciously or subconsciously. Stress management, that's a big one. Moving your body, but not over exercising too. So that's another thing. It's tricky with Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism because people tend to notice like either some weight gain without changing their habits, and then their first instinct is to either change their diet by lowering, the amount that they're eating or exercising more, when in
Hmm.
reality, it's actually a little bit counterintuitive because the body needs to feel super, super safe
Yeah.
in order for that metabolism to heal. So those are some of like the first things that I do with people before we would cut out gluten is start there. And then if we've done all of those things and everything's in check, and then they feel like they're in a place where I do feel like I notice some sensitivity around
Hmm.
gluten. Maybe let's try taking it out. And we would take it out for maybe 30 days
Yeah.
and then add it back in and then see if we notice any symptoms pop up again. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that low hanging fruit. Start from
Mhm.
the bottom and
Yeah.
work our way up.
Yes.
And it sounds like your approach is more let's just trial it versus try any of these food sensitivity tests or anything
Oh,
like that.
no. No, no, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because a lot of the time, those food sensitivity tests will come back like just lit up like a Christmas tree
Yeah.
where you have to cut out everything that you normally eat. And if you can imagine the amount of stress that that puts on the body of like how many foods that you have to cut out, that's definitely not going to help the thyroid. Like the thyroid is
Yeah.
a diva. She needs to to eat.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, and those antibody tests really aren't super specific. They're like you could have eaten an almond at age 5 once and have an antibody to that, but not actually have an almond intolerance. And so it's frustrating that those food sensitivities get like promoted. I
Yeah,
rarely see anybody that they actually benefit.
totally. Yeah. And I get it because
Hmm.
people want to turn to the food because it's what they know and it's what they can
Yeah.
like visibly see. And that's the first thing that we think of when we
Yeah.
think like something's wrong with me. Let me turn to the food to figure out what it is. And so I have like so much, you know, empathy for that situation, but
Absolutely.
most of the time it's not just the food. So.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And so another thing that I'm kind of gathering from what you're saying is that dieting is really not helpful for somebody with Hashimoto's. So tell me more about kind of your approach. And I take a very similar approach. Tell me more
Mhm.
about kind of your approach that's a little bit
Mhm.
moving away from diet culture and dieting and towards actually taking care of your body with food.
Totally. Yeah. So I always like to start off with helping people eating regular meals throughout the day. And I mean, like at least 3 square meals,
Hmm.
usually snacks in there as well, but also just listening to their body and eating when they're starting to get hungry versus when they're ravenous. I see that a lot. People
Yeah.
like kind of pushing it off and trying to ignore hunger signals. So just, honoring that hunger and recognizing that's a normal and a healthy, way to recognize when you need to eat something. So
Yeah.
we focus in on that. And then again, other than just eating consistently, we also like to prioritize, protein and high fiber carbs and
Hmm.
anti-inflammatory foods. So just brightly colored produce and
Yeah.
different like spices and but also making sure that we are including foods that are also mentally satisfying. So
Yeah.
things that we enjoy eating and, treats and, but also just paying attention to how your body feels after every time that you eat something. So really just drawing attention to how you feel is like one of the biggest things that most people can learn.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of more intuitive eating, mindful eating
Mhm.
approach you definitely are seeing is helping your patients.
Definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
How we've kind of talked about it, but can you dive into a little bit about
Mhm.
how disordered eating and dieting like can harm the thyroid and make Hashimoto
Mhm.
symptoms worse?
Yeah. Well, so first, like we talked about, that if there are nutrient deficiencies,
Hmm.
so the thyroid thrives on many different nutrients in order to function properly.
Hmm.
So if we're under eating or having disordered eating, like we are possibly going to be deficient in something. And then that automatically makes it harder for the thyroid to function properly. But then also, not to mention just like the disordered eating in terms of like stress and how harmful stress is to the thyroid, too. That if that's something, the body is resilient and it can handle stress for a period of time.
Hmm.
But if it's that, like I said, in addition to just other stressors in life and, life transitions and things that happen, then all of that together can definitely end up causing symptoms that maybe
Yeah.
weren't there before.
Yeah. And the thyroid needs calories
Oh,
too.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yes.
There's something called hypothalamic hypothyroidism, which
Hmm.
is essentially like just your body doesn't have enough energy to function and just a lot of different body systems start to shut down. So tell me what you've seen there.
Oh, completely. Yeah. So if that would be a situation where if it's not an autoimmune condition, so there's
Hmm.
no elevated antibodies, but we have a low thyroid function, so an elevated TSH, low, I don't think I mentioned T4 and T3 are the
Hmm.
main thyroid hormones that are tested. Um, then that would be a situation where there's hypothyroidism, but not from Hashimoto's.
Hmm.
So then that's a matter of figuring out, well, why is the thyroid stressed out and why is it lowered if there's not something attacking the thyroid. And that, I would say, like 9 times out of 10, at least in my client population, it's usually from under eating to some degree. And that's just, or nutrient deficiencies as a result of under eating. So,
Mhm.
yeah, that is fairly, I don't want to say common, but I see it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say that sometimes I'll have people feel better when they do start eating more and eat more regularly, but then still just need levothyroxine, and that's totally okay too.
Yes, yes, that's definitely something that I talk about with my clients too, that, Hashimoto's is, a chronic condition.
Hmm.
So it's something that even if it's well managed, it there's always going to be a chance that you can have flare-ups or you go through different stressful periods of time and then that, you have a resurgence of symptoms.
Hmm.
And it also definitely means that sometimes we need medication, coupled with nutrition and lifestyle
Hmm.
changes in order to feel our best. So there's like absolutely no shame involved if you need to take levothyroxine.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does Hashimoto's affect fertility?
Yeah. So again, if it is causing hypothyroidism, then definitely it can impact ovulation. It can also make it harder to produce progesterone,
Hmm.
which then makes it harder to carry a pregnancy. So there is increased risk for miscarriage with Hashimoto's.
Hmm.
And then also just kind of along with how there do tend to be some nutrient deficiencies like iron deficiency anemia, that obviously iron is super important for pregnancy too.
Hmm.
So that's very important. Anyone who has Hashimoto's, I highly, highly recommend getting like their iron checked
Hmm.
before getting pregnant. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And that's one reason why just preconception nutrition in general is
Hmm.
so helpful, is because we can then catch some of these things before you start getting nauseous and try and get those levels up a little bit and give you a little bit of wiggle room prior to
Completely.
pregnancy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say the other reason that if you do have Hashimoto's to not be afraid of levothyroxine is pregnancy is a big stressor on the body, and the fetus needs thyroid hormone from you in order to
Hmm.
grow and develop appropriately.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's another thing that, I mean, this would be another podcast in and of itself, but like that's potentially why more women have Hashimoto's than
Mm.
men because, well, particularly because estrogen seems to stimulate the immune system.
Mhm.
And that pregnancy, especially, is a time when your immune system is adapting and you're creating an immune system for your baby. So that could potentially be a time that, especially I find like either pregnancy or postpartum, especially, is when a lot of women are diagnosed with Hashimoto's,
Interesting.
potentially because of that immune system stimulation during that time.
That's
So
crazy.
it is, yeah.
Pregnancy is wild. It's really nuts. And the body is like so resilient, but I don't think we as women really have come to this place where we're like recognizing how hard pregnancy is just on the body, period, nutritionally, mentally, physically, and like from an immune perspective as well. And there's even theories about like how hyperemesis or preeclampsia are actually like immune related as well, which is really interesting, but agreed. Totally other podcast for a different day. When let's circle back a little bit. When you talked about kind of iron and B12, iodine, selenium is involved in the
Mhm.
thyroid as well. In my understanding, it kind of helps thyroid hormone do its job. Is that correct?
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't typically see like selenium deficiencies. Not that
Hmm.
it's, not doesn't happen, but
Yeah.
yeah. But that is another thing too, though, that I see where there's like some research studies that like adding selenium in potentially can help lower thyroid antibodies.
Hmm.
But again, that's just like it's not a silver bullet type of thing. So I think some
Yeah.
people will take selenium without knowing if they're deficient or not, and then sometimes, I mean, then they just get disappointed if it doesn't lower their antibodies. So I think
Right.
just, um, just taking an approach that like, some things may help, but there's no one thing, especially with the thyroid or with Hashimoto's, that it's going to be like, oh, okay, I'm all better. It's unfortunately not like celiac disease, where we know for a fact that the only thing or the main thing that you have to do is taking out gluten. It's not like that with the thyroid. With the thyroid, there's so many little things that could possibly be going on, which does make it trickier, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of the whole test don't guess type of thing. Sometimes it sounds like with selenium, maybe are you a fan of Brazil nuts? Do you feel like those are
Yeah,
adequate?
I'm a fan of Brazil nuts. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Um, I think like with Brazil nuts, like with anything though, it's we don't necessarily know
Yeah.
exactly how much selenium is in a Brazil nut, like
Mm,
because it depends on where it grows and like the quality of the soil and like
yeah.
yada yada yada. But it's certainly not going to hurt. I probably wouldn't do like more than two a day though.
Right.
You don't want to like have selenium toxicity either though.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what I was going to say too. We want to test not guess. And so with
Mhm.
supplements and certain foods,
Yeah.
like we don't want to just like consume a whole cup of selenium excuse me, of
Mm-mm.
Brazil nuts every day, because people don't know that Brazil nuts actually are very, very high in selenium.
Yeah.
And it is
Mhm.
possible to overdose on something that is quote unquote natural. And that goes for a wide variety of nutrients. I see people taking way too much vitamin D, and
Mhm.
that can be really not okay. So definitely it's
Yeah.
important to
More
test.
is not always better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, Awesome. Well, is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you think is just like really important for people to know about Hashimoto's, or about, I don't know, just diet culture and how it affects our relationship with food or fertility and the thyroid, anything
Yeah.
else?
Yeah, no. I mean, we kind of touched on it, but I just want to like reiterate too that Hashimoto's, if you have it, it is a lifelong condition
Yeah.
and it needs to be managed, but also like you have to give yourself some grace where we all go through different, seasons of life, and sometimes things will be under control and you'll feel good, and sometimes you'll have flare-ups, and just, not blaming yourself or beating yourself up if you go through those different phases. It just, takes some trial and error and figuring out what works for you at different stages of life. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you could leave us with a couple of just like basic tips, if somebody gets a diagnosis of Hashimoto's, what should they do first?
Yeah, so I would, one, make sure that you have a full thyroid panel. I don't think we talked about that, but like having the full thyroid panel is your TSH, your TPO and TG antibodies, your free T3 and free T4,
Hmm.
and reverse T3 potentially too. That's the full thyroid panel that shows us what exactly is going on with your thyroid, and if it's just the antibodies or if your thyroid isn't producing enough thyroid hormone. So I would
Hmm.
say start there. That's number one. And then next would be, probably working with someone to make sure that you're getting enough nutrients
Yeah.
and eating enough food, making sure that you're controlling stressors in your life, not over exercising, then correcting any nutrient deficiencies. There's many other things too, but I would say like maybe working with someone who has that knowledge set so that they can guide you through it too, so that it doesn't feel, too overwhelming to do
Yeah,
all at once.
absolutely. And just knowing that like you deserve good support no matter what. And
Mhm.
it some practitioners, some like regular medical doctors are absolutely fantastic. So you don't
Yes.
have to see a naturopathic doctor, but if you wanted to, you could. You can see a
Mhm.
dietitian, you can see all three of us.
Yeah. I
There's
guess.
many
Yeah.
options.
That is one thing I will say though is, and again, there's nothing against any other medical provider. Like we all have our place in the healthcare system, but
Yeah.
um if you have a history of disordered eating. Sometimes if you have Hashimoto's and you go to a naturopath or a functional medicine doctor,
Hmm.
they will immediately put you on an autoimmune protocol diet.
Yeah.
And that can just be very triggering for a lot of people. And I also don't think it's totally necessary. I don't think I've ever recommended it for anyone, to be honest, because
Yeah.
it's always just so incredibly stressful. So just kind of being aware of that, and even if that is something that's recommended to you, just knowing yourself and
Yeah.
knowing what advice to take and maybe what to leave on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. I feel like there's definitely a lot of problems on both the Western medicine side and the Eastern medicine side. I feel
Mhm.
like Laura and I like to sit here in the middle, where
Yes.
Laura's like slightly more functional, integrative, and I'm like slightly more regular, do a little bit more eating disorders type stuff. But
Yes.
both of us, we complain about this all the time when we get coffee. Is us. How sometimes we feel like our clients aren't getting listened to in the Western medicine model, or they're getting like put on too many crazy diets and supplements. They go see a
Hmm.
naturopath. So it's definitely really frustrating, especially because us as dietitians, like we can only do so much for our patients too.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
if this is a situation that you have landed yourself in, just know that we see you. And we have referrals if you're here, especially if you're here in Charlotte. We have our doctors that we like to send people to. But anyways, I know that you have a workbook, right? A thyroid workbook that's for sale on your website. So
Yep.
tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So it definitely goes way more in depth into the thyroid and Hashimoto's than
Hmm.
what we were able to cover on this podcast. So if you're interested in digging more into it, it's on my website, laurarosenutrition.com. Just hit shop and it's available on there. It's just a really, really thorough downloadable PDF, basically, that just goes into literally everything that you could ever want to know about the thyroid, but I think in pretty, easy to understand terms.
Yes, I would agree. I we were just talking about this before we hit record that I had bought the workbook a couple years ago, and I found it really helpful and have recommended it to some of my patients too. But definitely goes into even more of like the myth busting and like where to start and all that kind of stuff. So, such a great resource, Laura. I love that you have that. And if folks want to just hear more from you or work with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at hormone_nutrition or at my website, laurarosenutrition.com.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Laura. Let's get lunch soon since we know each other in real life.
I know. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.